topic for today is the missionary activity of the church. And so this is the second of the decrees that are kind of the spin-off from the basic theology that's been mined and expressed in the four constitutions. And of course, these things are going on simultaneously, so some things that you find here were not in already published materials, but they knew that they were going to be saying similar stuff, say, for example, in Government Best. Well, there's a background story to this that is kind of significant. By the first session in October, November, December of '62, pretty much just kind of got going. The bishops sort of found their stride. They expanded the theological committees tremendously, adding many of their own members. They began to figure out who among themselves, as bishops, were good theologians. Many of them had to admit that they really did not have a lot of theological background other than the typical seminary course. Many of them, all they had was a degree in canon law. That was pretty much the standard thing, that you had to have a degree in canon law in order to administer the church. And being a bishop pretty much was an administration job. In fact, up until the Vatican Council, the ordination sequence ended at priesthood, and that was you had arrived when you ordained a priest. It's St. Acts, after all, that was it. And then to be a bishop was simply an administrative post that an occasional priest might be chosen to be a bishop, but pretty much for administrative purposes. So many of the bishops simply had an advanced degree in canon law in addition to their seminary training. And so that was all the theology they knew. But some of them were really theologians. Dearden from Detroit, for example, was a real theologian, and he had taught theology and was reading theology, so he was recognized within the first couple of months to be one of the theological resources among the colleagues there in St. Peter's. So in the first session, they didn't pass any documents at all. They rejected the one on Revelation, wanted to start that all over again. They did accept the one on the liturgy, and they made some considerable progress with that one. It had already got it started off better than the others, and so they were able to really kind of affirm much of what was in there. They took a stand that the liturgy needed to be reformed, and so they kind of based the whole document on why they would reform it, how they would reform it. And so then they sent that all back to the working committee to refine it. And then pretty much they picked up a couple more documents and got going on them. They began to work on the one of the church, which at that time they're calling De Ecclesia, about the church. And then they broke for Christmas and went back home, and some committees were working throughout that time. They were receiving some updated stuff in the mail, and they got together again in the fall of '63. Things are kind of percolating along, and by November of '63, they're pretty much ready to make a final vote on the one on the liturgy. But the coordinating committee is getting really antsy. So you've got the heads of the Vatican offices, so the head of what was called the Congregation for the Inquisition. Inquisition is really not a nasty word. It simply means to inquire. You're inquiring as to the veracity of someone's teaching, right? So, And so Italiani, Cardinal Italiani, was the head of the Congregation of the Inquisition. Cardinal Agagenian was the head of the propagation, the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith. And so that would be the mission territories, which is this document. And Pizarro was the head of the Congregation for Seminaries. He was in his 80s, close to 90. So these bishops, these cardinals at the head of these various main departments of the Vatican, they were the coordinating committee of the council. They were getting really nervous. For one thing, this thing was just going on forever, and at this pace, with all these proposed documents, there were like 20 or 30 by now. They had kind of done some of that whittling down and condensing, and so they're down to like 20 or 25. And they're just thinking, if we go through every one of these with this kind of detail, voting on every paragraph, we'll be at this 20 or 30 years. You know, and so they're just saying, practically, this is just not going to be realistic. But also, theologically, they were getting really nervous because the work that was underway already, the percolating that they could see happening, was raising all kinds of new ideas and new ways of thinking about things that we had always thought were true, but, oh, does that mean this, you know? And so, the more you let these bishops talk, the more bright ideas they get. We won't even recognize the Catholic Church if we keep letting this go on. So they were pretty convinced that, all right, we've had enough innovation for this century. So they made an executive decision that from now on, for the rest of you guys, we'll accept the one on the church as a real deep one that's coming up. We expect something on Revelation. We're just about to pass one on the liturgy, but we're not going to have many more of these. From now on, just take your work that you've been doing and summarize it in 6 or 8 propositions. It might be, take 5 or 6 pages. Pick out the main propositions that you feel are true about seminary training or bishops or the missions or whatever it is, and just do that in so-called propositions or theses. Now, that was a very typical way of doing theology. When I was studying at that time, and I was studying for my licentiate in theology. What's a licentiate? That's a license to teach theology, right? So, here in America, you go to college, you get your degree, but then you have to pass a board in the state, you know, to get a license to practice medicine or nursing or psychology or whatever. But there in Europe, the university issues you the license, and you have a license to teach that subject anywhere. So a licentiate means that. So in order to pass a licentiate, they had 100 propositions that you had to learn in 4 years. And you knew this right from the start. And every course that you had, there would always be a summary of the propositions that you're going to learn about in this particular course. And when it came time for your final exam, we had these 100 propositions all on a couple pages, and we had to learn, be able to speak to each of those 100 propositions. So that's kind of the way they did theology. So they said, all right, from now on, the rest of you folks, you just make up 5 or 6 propositions that you feel are worthwhile, and then we'll pass on those, and we could probably be finished by the end of this session, 1963. Well, that seemed like an efficient thing to do, but a lot of bishops were not very happy. They began to grumble, and because they're beginning to like doing theology. And granted, it's taking time, but they're getting along with each other. They're meeting new people. They're discovering new ways of thinking about themselves and the church and their mission and what the ordination is all about and everything else. So they're kind of enjoying this process much more than the coordinating committee was. And the noisiest group was missionary bishops. And there were a lot of them, because you had all of Africa and Asia. I mean, there were lots of places where the church is not the established religion. Keep in mind, the model at that time was Europe, where everybody was Catholic, except a few stupid heretics. And the church literally impregnated all of society, and to be Italian was to be Catholic, to be Polish was to be Catholic, and to be Irish or whatever, French was, to be Catholic. Well, there are other parts of the world where that wasn't true, so those were called missionary territories. In fact, the United States was a missionary territory until the early 1900s. For whatever reason, they let us become an adult church, even though we hadn't entirely impregnated society. So the missionary bishops, they were not very happy for two reasons. One, they really enjoyed being able to participate as missionary bishops, kind of like considered to be second-rate citizens, and yet here in the council, they are accepted as equals among all the other bishops, so that was kind of neat. Secondly, they were not at all content with the arrogant and autocratic way that the propagation of the faith ran the show. They pretty much had to be constantly bowing to the propagation of the faith, which didn't know a darn thing about different cultures. They didn't care about different cultures, because the whole point is those lands are all barbarians, and the whole point is make them Catholic so they can become civilized. That's how you become cultured. And so they didn't think they needed to know about different cultures in Africa. Just make them Catholic, and then they'll be cultured. So these bishops were unhappy. So they began to pass in requests to speak, and these requests, just a summary of what they're requesting, obviously they were beginning to kind of raise some sand on the main floor. Well, Pope Paul VI decides to come to join the group. Now, he had not been doing that. John 23rd didn't either. Recall, the only time John came onto the floor of the council was that time where they were voting on whether or not they should accept this draft on Revelation. And it was a very poor draft, but they couldn't get the 2/3 vote to discard it. They got about 60%. And so they were kind of shrugging their shoulders. I guess we have to live with it. And the next day, Pope John 23rd came to the session and said, I understand what we're doing here, but I really feel that there's as many as 60% of us who are unhappy with this. We simply do have to accept the mind of the House here, and we are going to discard this draft. Well, that was looked upon as being a brilliant stroke of genius, even though it seemed, from one point of view, to be a little bit autocratic. People really appreciated that intervention. And so here, now we have a different thing going on, where they've got a new policy that they're establishing, and there's some restiveness, not wanting to accept this notion of just summary propositions instead of doing real theology about these topics. So Paul VI comes to the floor, and he says, pretty much in many words, I understand that there's some concern about the method of the propositions, and surely these propositions can be tweaked, but it really looks like a good thing to do. And then he stayed for Cardinal Agagenian, who was the head of the mission department, Propagation of Faith, to give his little speech supporting the notion of writing. I think he had 9 propositions that would work. And then Paul VI left. Well, then the bishops kept talking, and they kept saying, no, we're not going to stop doing theology. We like doing theology, and we're going to do some theology about the missions and everything else. And so they then simply took it upon themselves to establish a whole new committee of 5 bishops and some theologians. Ratzinger was one of them, Kamgar was one of them. And they said, let's start over. We're going to write a document on the mission of the church. We're not going to settle for a few propositions in 5 or 6 pages. And so it was a pretty much kind of a rebuff of Paul VI. And people felt that Agagenian had put him up to that. Agagenian claimed he hadn't, but Agagenian, of course, was very happy that the Pope did support the notion. But in any case, so that pretty much killed the idea. So the council went on then for 2 more years with coming up with the 16 documents that we have now. And all of them are a work of theology. They're not all the same breadth, but they all are true theology. They're not just a couple of propositions. All that to say, this particular statement that we have here today is the result of a real serious work with some missionary bishops involved in the writing of it. And Agagenian is technically the chair of the committee, but he would always come late to the meetings, often leave early, often would just come, make a statement that he expected everybody to simply say, oh yes, Your Eminence, and then leave. In fact, there in Kamgar's notes that he has that 900-page journal of the council. At one point, after Agagenian had come and gone in one of those 5-minute appearances, somebody on the committee says, see, we do have a chair of our committee. A little bit cynical. Well, so what we have here, and I have both last time and this time with the apostolate of the laity, and then this one, I have gone through the 4 constitutions, and it took, in this case, 2 pages. But the reason I'm doing that is to illustrate that some of the things that we're going to find outlined in the document on the mission of the church, it is, in seed form at least, it is already there in the constitutions. Technically, we probably could operate if we just had these 4 constitutions. It's like that prayer that the Jews sing at Passover. If you had led us out of slavery and not got us to Sinai, that would have been enough. If we had got to Sinai and didn't get to the desert, it would have been enough. Well, if we had had these 4 constitutions that didn't go any further, it would have been enough. It would have got us going. Huh? But I think fortunately, we took the time to actually do 12 more takes at this. Not completely original ideas, but born from the thinking that's in these 4 constitutions. And so when you go through these 4 constitutions, you find several references to the church's mission in the world, to everybody. So even the very brief constitution on the Word of God, there's that reference that God didn't just come to talk to Catholics. God has spoken to the whole human race and continues to speak to the whole human race. So, and by the way, there's a case where there's omnes and not multis. So the Word of God is meant for everyone, and that all of us are involved in it. In the liturgy, of course, the whole point of the liturgy thing is to get full, active, conscious participation. And the point of the liturgy is to just kind of be the worshiping presence of people who worship everywhere, and to let that be a sign to the whole human family that God is God, and that we do worship God, and it's a joyful experience. Lumen Gentium, the document on the church, there are several places where it talks about enlightening all people. Lumen Gentium, light of the world, right? Light of all the nations. Union with God and the unity of all humanity. The church's universal mission. Paragraph 16, all people, whether that's Christians or Jews or Muslims or searchers, and they list these things, searchers for God even those who do not recognize the need for God, they're all being prepared for the gospel by whatever goodness and truth is found in them. In other words, grace is at work. Saving grace is at work in the entire human family. Many of those people are in the church, but a lot of them aren't. And so, but grace is there. The saving grace of God is present and fermenting in everybody, in every culture. It may not be explicit, and it may be camouflaged, but it's there. And so our job is to simply kind of recognize how that God's divine grace is present in people. Notice that paragraphs that had 16 and 17. When Jesus sent his apostles to make disciples of all nations, therefore the church continues without ceasing to send out preachers until new churches are fully established, and they themselves continue the work of evangelizing, compelled by the Holy Spirit to bring actual completion to the design of God, that the fullness of the whole world may move into the whole people of God. So, and this is the Lumen Gentium, which is the document on the nature of the church, but it has that outward look. Top of page 2 there. The whole universe is intimately united to humanity. The church is intimately united to humanity, and it attained its goal to be established perfectly in Christ. So this is even broader than just the human family, but the whole universe is, all of creation is consecrated by God. This is a fairly novel statement, by the way, and it never would have been dreamed of before this. But now, when you have people who are really concerned about ecology and caring for the earth as a sacred mission, not just as a practical thing of reducing pollution, here it is. All of creation is consecrated by God, and the human family happens to be responsible for this particular part of creation. At least we don't have much to do with, well, we're going to try to bring a satellite and take an asteroid to get it to circle the moon. That's an interesting thing, whether we can pull that off or not. It's a little bit arrogant, but we certainly have responsibility for our planet anyway. And here you have statements like this that lead you to the realization that yes, this is not just a practical, pragmatic thing to be concerned about the environment, but it's a sacred mission to care for the planet. So that's Gaudium, that's Lumen Gentium. Gaudium et Spes, of course, the church in the modern world. Practically every page of it has to do with the whole world around us and the whole family of the human race. We're in a new stage of history, exploring the depths of the human mind with new freedoms, uncertain about some confusions, competing ideologies, and social disorder, but these realities demand an answer from us. So in other words, we are participants in the human project. We're not just kind of off in the corner by ourselves. So the mission is not just about little number 4 there in the middle of page 2. Mission is not just to make more Catholics. It joins us with the whole human project. It's all infused with grace. All focused on the common good. So, near the bottom of page 2, the second last paragraph. The relationship between culture and Christian formation is not always without difficulties. But such difficulties are not necessarily harmful to faith. They can even stimulate a more accurate and deeper understanding of faith. Since there's a difference between the deposit of faith and the manner in which it is expressed, theologians should be continually looking for more appropriate ways to communicate doctrine to the people of our time. In other words, the evangelizing process is a two-way conversation. It's a proclaiming the gospel, the good news of salvation, but it's also listening to people, listening to them raise their own questions and address their problems and wonder about things and give their own opinions about how God is present in their life, and then kind of interact that way. And that's how the proclamation of the gospel works. It's a two-way conversation. So these are things in the four constitutions that lead you to be able to say that we are a missionary church, that our church is designed to kind of go out into the whole world. So that really does kind of define us. So if that's all we had, it would have been enough. It would have got us started. And so to that extent, I suppose that the coordinating committee, they did have a point. We could just deal with this, and then we can keep working on these things later on. But it wouldn't have the same gravitas, the same significance. A conciliar document is important just because it's a conciliar document. And so the fact that the entire assembly of Catholic bishops can come to an agreement over something is a much more significant thing than to have some individual theologians 10, 15, 20 years from now coming up with ideas that can be interpreted from the four constitutions. So that's the reason why the bishops insisted on taking charge of doing some other documents as well as the constitutions. And so they do create this one on the missionary activity of the church. So here it is, pages 3, 4, and 5. It begins with what we've already been saying. God has sent the church to all nations, a universal sacrament of salvation, proclaiming the gospel to all. In this new era of humanity. In other words, there's a recognition that the world is different now than it was in Jesus' day, or Paul's day, or Thomas Aquinas' day, or the day of the Council of Trent. All of these different era of the church dealt with proclaiming the good news to the world, but they had to do it in different ways because the world was different in all those different times. And so now we have a new era of humanity. And the church is called to be salt of the earth and light of the world, the salvation and renewal of every human being in this new situation that we find ourselves in. So that's paragraph 1. Now, notice what in paragraph 2, on the one hand, what is familiar, a missionary church is not new because we've been doing this for centuries. But notice in the what is developing column, the Pilgrim Church is by its very nature missionary. The whole church is by its nature missionary, drawing its origin from the mission of the Son and the mission of the Holy Spirit, after the plan of God the Father. In other words, the very nature of God is missionary. God, when we believe in the Holy Trinity, we're not just believing in a kind of a spiritual Rubik's Cube that you can kind of spin around and see if you can fit it together, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, one God. But the whole point of that is that God is not just a lonely deity sitting up there all by himself. God is emanating its reality, in the terminology we use, is the Father generating the Son. And then, that doesn't stop there, but then the Father and the Son generate a spirit of love. So you've got this outward movement going on right in the very nature of God. So that God sends the Son and sends the Spirit of love between the Father and the Son. So this notion of God reaching out. Here's where you see, and I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but at that time this was a very significant arm wrestling match going on here between Cardinal Agostinian and the Propagation of the Faith Office. They agree that the Propagation of the Faith Office is still important, but that it should be not just an administrative office, but also dynamic. And by dynamic, they mean all these things under what is developing, that you have to really be enthused about the different cultures where the church is being planted. You have to call in the advice of bishops to help you figure out what's going on there. You have to take advantage of national groupings of bishops. You have to make sure that all the laity are involved. Well, the Propagation of the Faith Office is nowhere near wanting to do stuff like this. But they're charging, they're saying, all right, we're going to leave you in charge, but we expect you to do this. And so this particular chapter took some doing to get some agreement. But the missionary bishops, they're the ones who crafted this, and they really wanted to reform the Propagation of the Faith Office. Well, then finally, chapter 6, cooperation. 35 and 36, since the entire church is missionary, spreading the gospel is a fundamental duty of the people of God. The council invites everyone to a profound interior renewal, assuming personal responsibility for proclaiming the good news. Their fervor will be a new spiritual breeze throughout the whole church. That's a nice way of putting it. A new spiritual breeze throughout the whole church. All bishops are consecrated not only for a particular diocese, but for the salvation of the whole world. 38.3. Bishops should encourage their better priests to offer themselves for missionary work. And a lot of bishops did after this. So, for example, the Detroit Diocese, one of our better priests is Bob Singer. And he went as a young priest to Recife, Brazil, and spent his entire career there. He's back home now. He's older than I am, but he spent his whole time in Recife, that large parish there, and several sisters worked there as well. So our diocese kind of adopted that parish. It was not the whole diocese, but that parish. It's a fairly large district and it's many people kind of coming in from the country, right around this hillside, around the city, desperately poor, but the church is really present there. So we sponsored that mission. Now, we don't have any priests there now, so it's pretty much been handed over now to the Diocese of Recife, Recife is the name of the city. I think there's anyway, maybe Recife is the diocese. Anyway, that's where Dom Helder Cameron was the bishop there. So that was our venture to do this. The Bishop of Boston established the Society of St. James. And so many priests joined this, sort of like a temporary missionary order to go to Latin America. I forget what place they went to. Cleveland sent priests to Central America, where San Salvador. And so they continue, and this is the very last sentence about the lay people should be involved in it too. The lay faithful, 41, encouraged to consider personal service and missionary work. So this is called COAR, C-O-A-R, and they've established a school there, and they work with the current Bishop of San Salvador, and they send this booklet out like once every quarter at least. And the people of Cleveland continue to sponsor this, and they tell who are all the people who are giving gifts and whatnot. They go down and visit. So there's a lot of personal contact between the Diocese of Cleveland and this mission in El Salvador. So this is an example of really doing what is called for here. I don't see this happening a lot in most places. Just the other day, I was talking with a woman who she belongs to what's the large evangelical church up in Troy, Kensington. She went to India for just a week or two. They have a missionary relationship with this place in India. And as she's talking about it, she's breaking into tears. And it was such a powerful experience for her. Now, only for 2 weeks, but her whole vision of the world has expanded because of that experience. Now, granted, that could be looked upon as sort of holy tourism. And so you have to kind of ask yourself, what is the actual purpose of that establishment in that place in India? I didn't have the time to talk with her about that in detail. But this particular operation seems to be an opportunity for lay people, as well as there might be one or two priests who are still involved in it, who actually have a purpose. There's a fairly large church and a big school, K through 12, and these kids are kids who would be mainly orphans and would not have any education at all. These are desperately poor kids, but so they run this school in this particular town. So this is an example of what chapter 6 is talking about, of a whole church getting involved. And we have some ways to go yet before we can kind of even get up to speed in this much. We have more work to do. But the proposal is laid out there. So this is more than just 6 or 8 little proposals. This becomes a real decree on missionary activity. And it's theological, and it's drawn from Lumen Gentium, and of course, when Church of the Modern World gets passed, a lot of this stuff will be in there as well. So, questions? Yes?
I often hear...
microphone.
I often hear, and I know some people here are probably thinking the same thing, that when people talk about our school, that one of the things that we feel from the diocese is they're not all Catholic. So all of this is telling us the support that we need from our own diocese, so that we're doing exactly this. And that's what we're trying to do, but everything's making it hard for people to be Catholic in the city because of people not recognizing the mission in our city.
And keep in mind that sometimes the very word mission implies second-rate status. But this document is saying that's not true. Mission means reaching out and getting everybody involved in a first-rate status, what it means to be a child of God. So yes, so running a school in the city is a missionary project in the best sense of the word. Yep.
I have to tell you, first of all, that Fred and I drove here together, and I was told that he wouldn't take me home unless I behaved. So I'm trying to be good.
So we'll expect it.
Okay. Yeah, okay. First of all, I have to tell you that a wonderful sister told me one time, we do not educate them because they are Catholic. We educate them because we are Catholic. Amen.
Right.
Okay. Can I go back to 6.1 or 2? 7.1. Since salvation comes through the church, isn't that where we got, you will go to hell unless you're Catholic?
Well, that was kind of the thinking, but salvation comes to it not only, doesn't say through only to the church, but does come to the church. So that means there is a right, an obligation for the church to be dynamic and reaching out. But notice it's in the column of what is familiar, so that's kind of stated in the old way of thinking of things. And then you go on there, but God leads all kind of people into salvation. So we are open to that, stimulating that grace. But yeah, you have to be careful you don't interpret that as being, you've got to be Catholic in order to be saved. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Now let's go to 15.7. 15.7. Various ministries are needed. Priests, deacons, catechists, and lay Catholic action. No religious.
Well, yes, and that's all they knew about at that time. So when they talk about lay Catholic action, they are thinking of lay people who do it because they're baptized, not because they're in a lay institute. So they are trying to include lay people. But as we heard last month in the apostolate of laity, everybody actually is involved in the apostolate.
But what about religious sisters? There is no mention. Okay, religious vow life should be encouraged.
Okay.
But the ministry,
Yeah, well,
16.4, or I'm sorry, 15.7. Various ministries are needed. Priests, deacons, catechists, and lay Catholic action. Now, in the 60s, when I was going to school, the ministries were pretty much religious sisters.
yes. Well, it looks like they don't include them in that particular sentence. They're trying to focus on deacons and catechists, I guess, and in doing so, they left out the whole role of medical missionaries and all the other very noble sisters, and lots of sisters were involved in missionary work. If you look in the one on chapter 4 on missionaries, you'll find more reference there. You may find specific reference to sisters. But I don't know if you were not. So that's a point well taken. It seems to be a little gap there.
One of the things that struck me when you were talking about beginning the Trinitarian ground of the missionary activity is that the Mass is misa. So it's
Yes.
sort of like essentially the action of the liturgy is ascending. That was just thrilling. I thought, hey, that's the Trinity Sunday homily.
Yes. It's the very last word we say. Go, you are sent out on your mission. That's right. Yes. The very word Mass means mission.
As you went, as you went through all of this, it's amazing how many changes, and all of us here have been living some of them, maybe not to the 100%, but we have done it, especially here because of the conscious of it. But right now the question is in my mind, it's just a curiosity. The Pope, we're not supposed to say Pope, right?
Bishop of Rome, Francis.
The Bishop of Rome. What do you think the response in do you think that's going to, we're not going to say for the Pope Francis, blah, 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 or we're going to call him Bishop? What change would that bring to us? If, those who ever act, they must be going crazy.
I think Bishop of Rome, Francis, has really pored over these documents. Now he's just a bit older than me, so he would have been Well, and he was a Jesuit, so they studied theology forever. So he would have been studying his theology while this was going on. So I'm sure he has pretty thoroughly tried to digest all of this stuff. And when what he's doing now in terms of trying to reach out to the poor and whatnot, he's using this kind of language. He really is, this mission language, significantly. So we'll see how that unfolds. It could very well be that this is, even though Ratzinger helped compose these documents, Francis may in fact be, in a way, living them in a way that, in a pastoral way, that will be very important for us. So, yeah, I think that's a thing to look forward to.
In 6.1 and 6.2, the same visible church works everywhere, but the mission is carried out differently under different circumstances. And I thought about it in thinking about how when they were explaining the changes in the New Roman Missal, one of the main things there was that it's to become more universal, that the language imposed on us English-speaking ones in the Missal was to make it universal, and it seems to me at least flies in the face of that statement.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Notice that the way the Missal was introduced was pretty much the way propaganda fide used to operate. It comes from on high, and just imposes it on everybody. So, in fact, there's a reference, there's a long article in the National Catholic Reporter coming out soon by John Allen, and he's kind of evaluating his first take on Francis's theology and his administrative background and whatnot. And he makes a reference there, I don't know where he gets this from, but that it would appear that he will restore more authority to the local National Conference of Bishops, for example, the translations of the liturgy. So it's possible that there is already some movement in that direction. I don't know where he got that from, but he makes that statement that's likely to be the style that we're going to see. So I certainly hope that that's the case. Because what's happened is this centralization, which really was the old-time church before.
On another section, they're talking about the Cleveland initiative, and that there are several groups like the Maryknoll that have their lay missioners, and they still perform that, and they still do that.
Good point, excellent point. Many of those orders have brought. You don't have to belong to Maryknoll as such. You become an associate and engage in whatever way you want. Yes, that's right. Thank you.
Just some information as you're speaking about how we as a diocese are doing things overseas. Deacon Gene Bauman and Deacon Rick Misiak have both spent times in Africa. I have no idea what stimulated that, but it's been more than just a passing kind of fancy. I think part of it is they are somewhat of a bridge trying to encourage more effort to do those kinds of things. First question I had was back when you were talking about the missionary areas consider themselves second-class citizens. Do they hold out a carrot somewhere along the line? If you can do all this, you can become a diocese. Is that what they're looking for, in part, some recognition that, hey, we're a real church?
Yeah, they were, up until this point, they were looked upon as being sort of just this kind of auxiliary function from this Vatican office to Nigeria or wherever. And what they're calling for is, we are an authentic church. So they're really pushing for that. That's exactly what's in their minds, that they want to be recognized as a full authentic church. And granted, we may be a very poor neighborhood. We may always need some kind of financial support or be grateful for educational or medical expertise, but we are church. And so there is a strong push to be recognized in that regard. That's why in that one chapter about getting a panel of bishops involved, because they would then give that credibility. Yes, we are all equal bishops. So the missionary bishops, frankly, most of them were not native-born bishops. At this point, they were still foreign-born missionaries who had gone there as priests to be missionaries, and some of them became bishops. So you didn't have an awful lot of people who were native Africans yet at that point who were bishops. You were beginning to get some African priests at that point. When I was studying there, right next to our college was the Propagation of the Faith. They had their seminary, where most of the seminarians were from Africa. Interestingly, we had almost no contact with them at all. That was an ideal opportunity where we could have. They didn't even go to school with the grade with us. They were completely separate. So they just were kind of a little enclave of their own. The one thing we did with them was in the summertime, we had a villa out in the country with a swimming pool. And we invited them out to share our swimming pool sometimes in the summertime. And we even had little games that we, kind of a mini Olympics between the Africans and the whites. So, but that whole notion of native clergy, and so they make a reference here that the pastor, when they say pastors becoming native, they're talking about the bishops. So they're pushing for that. These are, for the most part, Irish, German, American missionaries who are now bishops in Africa and in India, in some parts of Latin America.
When they talk about, doing the interculturalization and activities like that, how do they strike the happy medium? I mean, there's probably a lot of traditions and, actions out of these cultures that maybe just would be, dangerous or what have you. How do you get that happy medium out there?
Well, that is a good question, and they say you've got to try to strike that balance. They don't say how you're going to do it. Because now, shortly after the Vatican Council, we became exposed to an African Gloria, and the whole what was it called? Misaluba. And it was African-style music, and dancing was involved in it. And so there was really an excitement over that particular liturgical setting. In the Polynesian Islands, up until fairly recently, in the Polynesian Islands, you have to dance while you're talking. You move your entire body all the while you're talking. Everybody does that. That's a part of the expression. It's like facial expression. And so the liturgy, you have to kind of be in motion. You have to be dancing. And the Propagation of Faith felt that was too sensuous. That's one of the things you had to cleanse out of that pagan culture. You had to get them to be more refined and more dignified and have a proper procession coming down the aisle. Well, these guys who are now ordained priests from that culture, so I saw a film and just to watch this guy at the Eucharistic prayer, just in motion, it was fun to watch him. But he was just really expressing the prayers of the congregation, the whole Eucharistic prayer, while in motion. And watching the procession come down the aisle, there's a bishop who was receiving the gifts of bread and wine. And this whole procession coming down the aisle with the chalice and the bread and everything. But that was considered to be dangerous kind of stuff. But finally, using this as the guide, they have figured out a way to make this be more graceful and respectful, but still culturally expressive and enjoyable. But that is the question that you have to kind of consider. The same thing would be true, and that's how much do you want to use contemporary music in liturgy? That's all constantly a struggle that we always have. But I would think with younger people, if you can get them involved. There was I would sometimes say a youth mass at St. Fabian's, and I asked them if they could do a song by Arcade Fire. And they looked, eyes got big, and they said, "Oh, we'd like to do that song." So we incorporated that into that, because I could see that would fit the readings that I was going to have in a couple weeks. Yeah, so they learned to do it.
I think if we look at our history, Christianity has adopted many things over the 2,000 years. I mean, our choice of the date for Christmas is based on a Roman holiday. Yeah, and there's similar kinds of things that we have grabbed onto and said, yes, we'll take that in. That's part of our universality. But you have the good question. What do you pick up and what don't you? That takes wisdom.
Well, I think we have to call it quits. We have a funeral at 11. So thank you very much. Next week, what are we doing next week? Next month? That's the difference comes next. We'll see you next month, though.
Pastoral office.
Oh, pastoral office of business, all right. The old cliche, you know, that love doesn't work unless it's given away, right? So that's what love is. God is love. God can't just sit there all lonely by himself. God has got to be emanating. He's got to be reaching out, got to be flowing out. So the world participates in that, in the Trinity. The very fact that we are made in the image of God means that we are not only able also to love, but we're called into that loving relationship that God is. That we're all part of that. So that's what's going on here. And notice that they're fairly careful in their wording. They talk about God sends the Son, and then the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father through the Son. The Son sends the Spirit from God. Now this is meant to tweak the clumsy way that the Western Church have been saying it, with the Holy Spirit that proceeds from the Father and the Son. And the word in Latin is filioque. In our Nicene Creed, we've added a word. It's not in the original creed from Nicaea. In the original creed, the Father sends the Son and the Spirit, but the Father and the Son don't send the Spirit. The Father sends the Spirit too. That's the Greek version, and that's the way it was originally stated. We added the term filioque, and the Son sends the Spirit. Well, then that created a huge schism in 1054. That wasn't the only thing, of course, but that was the theological hammer that they used to beat up each other with. Notice that later in John Paul II's life, especially when he would be in any meeting with Eastern churches, when he said the creed, he did not use the word filioque. He dropped it out of respect for the fairly considered opinion that wasn't in the Nicene Creed in the first place, and maybe we shouldn't have added it, at least not to the point that it made such a problem. So here's what they did about that. They talk about how the Father sends the Son, and then the Son sends the Spirit, because in some way the Son is involved in the sending, but the Son sends the Spirit from the Father. So the Spirit's coming from the Father, but the Son is kind of getting the Father to do it. So that's the way they put it here. And that was acceptable to the Greek Catholics, the Eastern Catholics, not Greek only, but Lebanese and the other Melkites, and there were all the different rites took part in this council. So those who were of the Eastern rites, they were anxious to make sure that this formulation would be acceptable to the Greek churches, even those who were still Orthodox. And so that's what they came up with. But the notion that all of us participate in this dynamic, loving, reaching out reality that we call God. It's not just a static, self-contained, sort of smug universal power over the universe. It's a dynamic, loving, reaching out, expanding. It's interesting. Now, current astronomy and physics talks about the whole universe is constantly expanding, right? The whole universe is expanding at tremendous rates. We'll probably never see it change that much, but they can see that it's changed a lot since it started. And it's expanding. Well, that's interesting. That's an image of God, expanding. God, constantly expanding. So the church then is by nature missionary, and we as members of the church are by nature missionaries. So we're all involved in this. So the mission of the church, number 5, from Christ and the Holy Spirit, makes itself fully present to all peoples, opening them to the full sharing in the mystery of Christ. 6.1, what's familiar? The same visible church works everywhere. 6.2, but the mission is carried out differently under different circumstances. So, obviously we're all the Catholic Church, but we're going to do it differently in different circumstances. Now, Cardinal Agagenian's having a problem with that, but he can't help it. Everybody else thinks this is the truth. Since 7.1, since salvation comes to the church, there is both a right and an obligation to evangelize, but 7.1, but God leads people who do not know the gospel into salvation. So, in other words, God's saving grace is at work. The church is available as an instrument, as a tool, as an opportunity for God's grace to blossom. In some ways, we all need Christ as our model, master, liberator, savior, life giver. Missionary activity tends to the fullness to be achieved but at the end of time. Paragraph 8, Christ is the source and model of the new humanity. The gospel is a leaven of liberty and progress. It always shows itself as a leaven of fellowship, unity, and peace. So the church needs to be a sign of what the whole human race can hope for. Now, in the last 10 or 12 years, with the scandals that have been emerging, this is obviously not happening. It's just the counter thing that's happening, that we're being scandalized by the sins of the church. And that will always be just more or less the case, I suppose. But the point is that what we're supposed to be doing is giving people an admirable example of what the human family could become by being church. Even in a land, a community, a culture where the church is a small minority, we still should be able to kind of give a witness. This is what it would be like if all of us got to live together as brothers and sisters. So that's what they're proposing there in paragraph 8. So those are the doctrinal principles that they're laying out here. So this takes, 8 full pages. So this is a lot more than just a proposition. This is a bit of theology here, of seeing how the church and every Christian in the church is missionary by nature. The next chapter, 2, the missionary work itself. How does this go on? They make an interesting reference. They mention that they don't say the 3 billion, but they say 2 billion people in the world have not yet heard about Christ. So I had to look up and find out how many people were in the world in 1965, and there were 3 billion at that time. So about 1 billion of us had heard about Christ. The majority of those would be Catholics, but some other Christians too. And then 2 billion, 2/3, had not heard about Christ. So that was their statistic that they were using as an encouragement that we got a lot of work to do. As a matter of fact, right now, there are 7 billion of us, and as a matter of fact, the number of Christians is still about 1/3. So the proportion hasn't changed. There are more Christians today than there were in 1965, but there's a lot more people. So there has been some work, there has been some growth of the churches, not just Catholic, but evangelical churches to a great extent too. Some places more so. But we're still the same proportion that we were 50 years ago. 12.5 is important there. What is developing 12.5? The disciples of Christ are not seeking merely material progress and prosperity, but are fostering the dignity and union of sisters and brothers, teaching the religious and moral truths of Christ, gradually opening a wider approach to God. Now, this is an important thing because in the missionary lands, typically what missionaries have to offer is not just a place to go to church on Sunday. They often set up a school. They often set up a medical clinic. And so, well, Sister Fiorentina's little community is in Nigeria. And isn't there a clinic there with AIDS patients? And, you know, so there's a medical need there. And so they're doing some of that. They teach religion, but they do other things too. They work with families. So we are of service because our church has institutions of service for people's needs, medical needs, educational needs. So we can bring that expertise that we have. And surely, I remember there was a time when we were supposed to have a missionary come here from, I think, Ghana. And he was going to come all the way from Ghana just to talk to Christ the King Parish and then go back. Well, he would have spent more money in airfare than he would have collected here. So we talked to Father Maloney and said, you know, usually what happens is the missionary will come here and talk to 3 or 4 parishes all at the same time, one after the other, and that way they might together make it worth their while to come here. So we talked to Father Maloney and said, you know, if he's only coming to this one parish, this is not good. It's not going to be a good use of his money. So we have people in our parish who are from Africa. Why don't we let them make the missionary appeal, and we'll send it to this mission, to this particular mission. So Maloney agreed to that. So we had parishioners. They weren't all from Ghana. They were from Nigeria and other places too. But we had, half a dozen of them got up there, and they all spoke about what the church meant to them as growing up in Africa, how the church, and of course the biggest thing was education. They really appreciated the fact that they had gotten an education they never could have gotten otherwise. That this was a tremendous gift that the church had given them, and that the offerings that people had made over the years to the missions was able to provide schools for them to go to school in. But at the same time, they were just effusive what's like to go to church in Africa. And you've been there on Sunday morning, and where 2,000 or 3,000 people show up and they can't all fit in the church. They just completely surround the church, and the mass is going on inside, but it's the whole community is just celebrating every Sunday morning. It's like Easter every week. It's supposed to be, isn't it? So the point of this paragraph 12.5 is to make sure you don't think that the only role of the church is just to set up hospitals and schools. That is a very important thing that you can give as a gift to people, but what you're really bringing them is the message of Jesus Christ comes to bring you new life, and that this is one of the ways that we experience a new lease on life or a new chance at life. But the motivation is that of introducing people to Christ. Notice in 13.3, there's a strong prohibition against kind of what we would sometimes call rice Christians, of kind of making people come to church in order to get the food that you have to offer them. And of course, we would still do that today. We don't when we have the soup kitchen at St. Christine's, we don't make people become Catholic in order to eat lunch there, right? So that's a pretty obvious thing to us, but it isn't always obvious in some of the missionary territories. So those bishops were concerned that that was in there. Notice paragraph 14. Here's where they talk about the catechumenate, where adults enter the church. See, in the so-called established churches, everybody's baptized as babies. And so there isn't any such thing as a catechumenate as such, because everybody's baptized as infants, and then they're members all their life. But in the missionary lands, most people are becoming Catholic as adults. So we should have, just like the old days in the early church, we should have a catechumenate. We should have a formation process, gradually introducing people into the ways of the church, the teachings of the church. There should be catechists who walk with, and sponsors that walk with these catechumens to kind of introduce them to the ways of being a member of the church. And then there should be special rituals at Lent and Easter where this should take place. Now, see, that was not done. When my father became a Catholic in the 1930s, he had been Lutheran, so he was already baptized, went to a Lutheran church, sang in the choir. But when he became a Catholic, he had to get baptized over again. But it was just like about a 6-week meeting with the assistant priest in the parish, just he and the priest, and he enjoyed those. I know the name of the priest was Father Lehner, who gave my father instructions, because he would quote Father Lehner as he was, that's where he got his teaching about the Catholic Church. But there was no extended catechumen like you guys just went through here all last fall and through the winter. They didn't do that. There was no group. You didn't get to know anybody else who was becoming Catholic. There were relatively few, and so they all had private instructions. You got baptized just in private one Tuesday night. My father calls up at that time they had been kind of sweet up with each other, but then when my mother found out he wasn't Catholic, she wouldn't see him anymore. So he calls her up one day for a date, and she kind of thinks about it, takes a deep breath, and thinks, well, I guess it wouldn't hurt to go to one. So she agrees to go out with him. So she gets a nice dress on, and he picks her up. He takes her to the church, and she says, this is a strange place for a date. And they go into the church, and Father Lehner was there, and he's baptizing my father. And it was a surprise he gave to my mother. Well, of course, that won her heart, right? Couldn't say no, So that's the way the adults entered the church in those days, right up until the Vatican Council. So here you have an explicit, now it's also going to be in the liturgy document as well, but here they pick up on that and they say, here's where it really will work, where you can really have catechists who know their stuff and who can be part of the instruction of the people, sponsors, our liturgical process, using the season of Lent for the whole community to be engaged in this process, that kind of thing. So it's a nice way of putting into practice what is going to be stated in the liturgical document. By the time they voted this one in, the liturgical document has already been passed, so they're accustomed to the word. But here's where they're showing that it's a way of doing it. Paragraph 15, point 15.2 and 15.3 are both important and kind of idealistic. Every new Christian community should be formed in the fullness of the priestly, prophetic, and royal goals of Christ. What they're getting at there is that the missionary bishops were constantly being treated as second-class Catholics. that even if they had been there for some years in Nigeria or Ghana, wherever it was, but because they hadn't completely transformed, gotten everybody to become Catholic, they were treated as if they were just kind of stumbling around and not really true Catholics. And so what they're saying in 15.2 is that, granted, we all want to be sharing in the three functions of Christ, priest, prophet, and king. We want to do that. But once we do that, we need to be recognized that we are a legitimate church. We're not just a missionary outpost. We really are the church, just like we're the church in Paris, or the church in Rome, the church in New York. And what we've said in a previous document, where the liturgy is, there is the church. So we want to be called church. We want to have that full stature as church. And it may be that we've got a lot more work to do, but we want to do that. Then, in 15.3, let charity among Catholics of different rites shine out. So apparently there's a fair amount of competition. That's true even in Jerusalem right up till today. Competition among the different rites, all Catholic. But there's even more competition between different Christians who are not Catholic. So ecumenical activities should be fostered, avoiding both indifferentism. In other words, there are specific differences between being a Catholic or being an evangelical Christian. You may not automatically say one is better than the other, but they're certainly different. So, and if you are Catholic, you have reasons why you are Catholic. So in other words, that's what they don't want you to be indifferent. In fact, that doesn't make any difference. At the same time, there shouldn't be a lot of silly rivalry. That's the translation that we have in this version, silly rivalry, which of course is sometimes silly rivalry, but it occasionally ends up being more than silly. It becomes kind of vicious. So they were aware of the fact that there is ferment going on in these missionary lands by different church authorities and different church communities. And there needs to be some way to have some collaboration, some respect for one another, some mutual working with one another, that kind of thing. Now that turns out to be a more difficult problem than they anticipated here. That's true in Latin America as well as in Africa, that there is a tremendous amount of energy around, especially among evangelical churches, and frequently there are a lot of conversions going on, people who already are Catholic but are now becoming evangelical. And so that's a concern for many of the bishops in much of the world, including our own country. So not a lot of Catholics out in Northridge Sunday morning. 15.6, it's not sufficient just to use apostolate of good example. That's kind of in quote marks. There was some thinking, especially in France. They remember the worker priest movement and the little sisters of Charles de Foucault, little brothers of Charles de Foucault. They do not believe in explicitly talking about Jesus at all. The little brothers and the little sisters, for example, just get a job working as an orderly in a hospital or something, and they just do their job well. And they're literally almost an invisible presence of Christ. They don't believe in any kind of evangelizing, no proselytizing at all. They call that the apostolate of good example. So what paragraph 15.6 is saying is that that's not quite enough. There needs to be some conscious awareness of why you are honest at your job, why you don't cheat your employer, why you do a good job when you've got a job to do. that you're motivated by your membership in Christ. So there's something to be said for letting people know why you're truthful and honest and hardworking and all those things, and why you can be relied on. So that's what they're dealing with there. There needs to be some conscious awareness. 15.7, various ministries are needed. Priests, deacons, they mentioned deacons, which have been mentioned in the Lumen Gentium, I think. Catechists and lay Catholic action. So they were accustomed, they did know about lay Catholic action, but as we'll see, it should not just be a few people doing it. But there are roles for all these different people to be engaged in the mission. 16.4, priests should recognize the relationships between native traditions and Christian religion. Now, there's also a word, later on there's a word, syncretism, down near in the next chapter, 22.2. Every appearance of syncretism and false particularism should be excluded. Syncretism means that you simply take whatever the pagan rituals are and simply say, oh, all right, we can do that. So using what might be completely extraneous sacramental actions and make that be the sacraments without really trying to incorporate them into the sacrament of baptism or confirmation or matrimony. So you need to recognize native traditions, but at the same time be conscious of the unique participation in the Catholic Church. So that's a tightrope that you're walking there, but they want to be conscious of it. Up until this time, there was no conscious awareness of that. In Mexico, the Day of the Dead, that's a case where even the little confectionery sugar things that they make with skulls and whatnot, it's a little bit of syncretism there, where the kind of almost the fear of the other world and the way of tamping down that fear is to make sugar candy out of it, and that makes it palatable, right? So that always comes around All Souls Day. So the Catholic tradition is to pray for the souls of the dead, but you have also this kind of cultural thing that goes along with it. There, it works, but to some extent. Now, some bishops might call that syncretism too. Catechists should be trained. Here's an interesting place. This is important for the church at large. They were thinking in terms of missionary lands, but catechists should make a necessary contribution to the spreading of the faith. They should be trained adequately. Some of them may even devote themselves entirely. They might make this their profession. They should be paid a just wage for that in that case. Their canonical mission should be conferred. I sense a few people who may be questioning that. Their canonical mission should be conferred in a publicly celebrated liturgical ministry so that they have greater significance in their teaching in the community. Now, those are pretty much the same rules that the American bishops came up with in the co-workers in the vineyard. And there's basically four things. A person has to be instinctively, personally qualified to do the work just by their natural disposition. Secondly, they have to have some formation in ministerial work. Thirdly, they have to have some kind of public recognition, some kind of conscious statement, and then be missioned into the community, sent into their community. So there has to be a need for this in the church, and you have to be commissioned by the church to do that mission. So in that case, that's ministry. And I remember the debate they had about whether they should even call it ministry if it wasn't ordained ministry. Yes, you can, as long as there is the formation and the recognition, the conferral of the church says, yes, we need you to do this work to build up the church, to build up the body of Christ, as Paul would put it. So there's a way where they kind of give catechists a real, this is the first time you would have a non-ordained minister being recognized doing a formal work of the church. Of course, in the missionary lands, often the priest will only show up maybe once a month. And so he's not going to be able to give the kind of catechetical training to new converts that the catechumenate calls for. There has to be someone who is qualified to be the on-site catechist. So the catechist in a given town or village takes on a fairly significant role. In fact, when you have immigrants who come from Nigeria or some other African country, they may refer to maybe their father or their grandfather was a catechist, and that would be the same as saying he was the pastor of the church. He wasn't ordained, but a catechist, and that's very significant, very important. So that's a good insight that they have here, and that then can be extrapolated out in the work of the church at large. Well, we're running a lot low on time. Let me just, concerning particular churches, 19.4, missionary activities should also help those churches founded long ago which are experiencing a state of regression and weakness. They were aware that everybody in France and Italy wasn't going to church on Sunday. And so they realized that even in these so-called established Christian churches, where the whole community technically is Catholic, people are not actually participating very well. So there should be a new missionary activity there. Pope Paul VI picked up on this and wrote an encyclical on missionary activity, and he talks about the different levels of the missionary activity. Obviously proclaiming the gospel to those who never heard about Christ, but also proclaiming it to people who've heard about Christ but haven't really thought about what that means to me. And then thirdly, people who go to church, but they're not really sure why. They need to also be evangelized. So in other words, the evangelizing process goes on at all levels. This is where you will get that from. In concerning particular churches, 21.13, the church is not really established until there's a mature, active laity. So this would be the same thing that you have in People of God, in Lumen Gentium, the same thing you have in the decree on the apostolate of the laity. Everybody's involved in this. So we're all involved in mission. Chapter 4, the chapter on missionaries. There really isn't much new there. Everybody who's ever met a missionary, a white father, a married old priest or sister, a missionary, medical missionary, these people live this to the T. They're describing the genuine, heartfelt, sometimes heroic dedication that we know missionaries have had all through the years. So there's nothing new about that. What they're saying here is very familiar. What they don't say here is that the laity should be involved in this as well. They're really pretty much talking about the missionary institutes, which would be priests and nuns. So they didn't really take much of a step forward in that particular case. In the organizing of missional activity,